Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us on the Marketing Resolution YouTube channel. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, ring the little bell, and you'll get notifications every time we upload a new video. But first, I want to say again, thanks very much for joining us. Today, we are super lucky. We've got with us Rachel Virk. She's from Potomac Falls. She has a thriving practice there and a book, a great book, in fact, a book that I think would help, let's just easily say about 50% of the population. And the book is called The 4 Ways of Divorce. And the 4waysofdivorce.com is the website where you can find the book. Or conversely, I'll put Rachel's contact information in the description bar below so that you can find her and connect with her directly. Hello, Rachel. How are you?
Hello, Natalie. I'm great. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy practice to chat to everybody. I want to just say, first of all, your book is fantastic. It is an easy read. It's down to earth. It's kitchen English. And it's easy when I read it to see myself in the narrative, my friends in the narrative, my family members in the narrative. So it's really easily digested, and I like the way that you make it so easy for everybody to simply respond to these very basic answers that you give us.
Thank you for your kind words, Natalie. You know, I feel very passionate about helping people through this process and helping them to get their life back. And the book is just a how to get your mind where it needs to be, think about the path that you're on, think about your children, think about what you need to think about because you don't know what you don't know, and how do you not be taken advantage of by, the attorneys, maybe putting you down the wrong pathway, engaging you in the wrong process. So yes, there's a lot of good information in that book, and it was written to be very readable. There's one very heavy chapter, which is not easy to just skim through before you go to sleep at night. There's a lot of substantive information in that chapter, but the rest of it is just how to move yourself forward in this process of getting back on your new life plan.
Well, and it seems to me that whether you're the person seeking the divorce or whether you're on the receiving end of divorce papers, it can be such a tumultuous time in your life that under that kind of stress or duress or haste or emotion, it's too easy to take wrong advice. It's too easy to not seek advice and just go along. It's overwhelming for so many people, and your book gives such clear points of action and simple things to think about. It's if then this kind of a book, and that makes it so much easier for people who have or are in the middle of having everything in their life being altered in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and you hit on something that's significant in trying to determine how to move forward. Are you the person who wants out, or were you informed that your spouse wants out? And there are so many reasons as to why a marriage might end. It might be that people just aren't happy together anymore. Maybe they never really entirely were. Or there may be some dysfunction, substance abuse issues, mental health issues, or someone might be involved with somebody else. So the first step is really determining whether the reasons for the breakup should determine how you're going to dissolve the marriage, whether you're going to do it amicably or whether it's going to be very adversarial. And a lot of that can depend on why the marriage is ending.
Right. Well, I think one of the primary reasons that my friends have experienced divorce is sadly due to adultery. It might be that at some point in the relationship they started to fall out of love with one another and began looking for a replacement partner before their marriage was actually finished. But I think that adultery is probably one of it's got to be in the top two reasons for getting a divorce. I would think. I'm not a sociologist, but that's my best guess just from personal experiences. Is that something that you find to be true?
It's an extremely common reason for the breakup of the marriage. And sometimes someone might come to see me. Let's say it's a lady. Let's say she's been a homemaker and hasn't been out in the workforce. She's been taking care of the children, running the household, doing everything to keep the family going from being within the house. And then she finds the cell phone records or the emails or the text messages. It's usually something like that. And she comes to me and she's devastated. She's been married 20 years. Her kids are in their teens. She's maybe in her mid 40s, and she's scared and she doesn't want the marriage to end. And it's very important for people to understand that when a marriage is ending, each party goes through 5 stages. You know, those famous 5 stages, I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in on Death and Dying. Any kind of bad news, the first stage is usually denial. It's not happening, it's not real, if I ignore it, it'll go away, this is just a phase, they don't mean it. And there are some people that live in denial for years. It is not uncommon for people to be in denial for about 2 years, and they're ignoring their spouse working late, they're ignoring those, hushed phone conversations, they're ignoring the new password protections put on the computer and the phone, they're ignoring the fact that their spouse is on the computer a lot, and if they walk in the room, all of a sudden the computer is shut off or they click onto something else. And they just don't want to see it. And it's not uncommon for that to be going on for about 2 years. Then when they can't ignore it anymore, the next stage comes bargaining. Somebody's realizing that there's maybe a third person in the marriage. And it isn't uncommon for the paramour to also be married. And that's why the 2 people are not just immediately moving on, because the paramour is winding up a marriage. So after the denial comes bargaining. Well, if you stop talking to that person and let's do marriage counseling, which is often a prelude to divorce, not that that's a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing if you're going to divorce to do some counseling. But a lot of people will go to marriage counseling, and it is not uncommon for that process to uncover the fact that one of the parties, sometimes both, are really not committed to the marriage, and it's time to end it. And then after the bargaining comes grief, shock, fear, confusion, turmoil. This isn't what I planned. How can this bad thing happen? Life isn't fair. How can this person hurt me? How do we tell everybody? What about money? What about the kids? All that fear and anguish and confusion. And that's often the stage in which a person is finding themselves when they come to see me. And then after the denial and the bargaining and the grief, shock, fear, confusion, turmoil comes anger at the other party, anger at the person themselves, anger at the whole situation. And there are some people that get stuck in the anger and they stay in the anger. They become aggrieved and they can spend years as they're fighting through their divorce and post-divorce because they never get out of the anger. But meanwhile, the other person moves on and ignores the angry person and does what they can to move their life forward. And then should come acceptance. The marriage is over acceptance. So whenever marriage is ending, denial, bargaining, grief, anger, acceptance. And each party might be in a different part of that process. And people go back and forth through these processes. And one person might be in acceptance, the other person still in denial. So it is important to understand that, because how the marriage will be dissolved and how people will move forward is very much dependent upon whether someone is in denial or whether there's a person stuck in anger. So let's say somebody comes to me and they just found the cell phone records or the text messages and the emails, and they're in denial or bargaining. They don't want the marriage to end. I often find myself in the position, let's say it's the lady who's been the homemaker, where I have to tell her, your 20-year marriage is ending. They have moved on, whether it's with an actual living, breathing person or the idea of a living, breathing person. They've checked out, and you have to protect yourself. And there are things that they have to do right when they don't want to think about having to do it. There are some situations where I will find someone stays in denial so long, their spouse actually, if they're a passive aggressive person, starts making their life difficult, starts doing things to punish the children. I've had ladies come to me and say, this is the 5th affair he's had, because he might want her to leave him. He wants to be the victim, but he has to make it so intolerable for her to get her to take some action, because he wants her to take the action, and she's not, until finally he starts harming the kids and finally she comes to see me. Or he might actually send her some type of proposal or say, okay, yes, I want to end this marriage. I saw an attorney. Here's a separation agreement. I'd like you to look at it. And sometimes she might be in denial bargaining for so long, she will not look at it. And what happens in those cases, there is such a thing as waiting too long. In the beginning, sometimes in that situation, let's say it's the man having the affair and he's working and making good money, he might be very willing in that initial proposal to give her a lot, because it's like he wants permission to get out. He wants permission to go. He wants to be free. But the longer she makes him wait, and then he moves out and he starts incurring some expenses, and then he's thinking, well, why am I living in this basement bedroom apartment somewhere? I want a better place, and I want a better place, and wait a minute, why am I renting? Maybe I should buy a place. And the more time goes on, the less generous he gets, and she missed an opportunity to maybe get a better financial settlement.
Right. Yeah. So and now you mentioned a settlement agreement, and I do recall one of my cousins that was getting a divorce received a settlement agreement, and in her, because it wasn't a divorce agreement, it was a settlement agreement, it sparked a little hope, and it was misplaced, and it was it made me think that she's the same kind of person who buys a lottery ticket. Not that people who buy lottery tickets are bad people, but she had the same odds of getting back together with her husband. And so I felt like that process of her requesting a settlement, or her receiving a settlement agreement proposal, gave her undue hope that it should have gone right to a divorce conversation, not rather a separation agreement is what I mean to be saying. A separation agreement, not a divorce. And that separation agreement made her think, well, so maybe if I just do a little bit more, maybe if I get breast implants, maybe if I dye my hair, maybe if I lose some weight, maybe if I go back to school now, because I put him through medical school and I forwent going to college myself, so maybe he thinks I'm stupid. So maybe if I get my degree at this age, that will help and I can get him back. Is that something that happens in your office?
Well, you've hit upon about 4 different topics. So I'm going to try to take one of them first, which would be the agreement that was presented to her. It isn't so much the title of it, whether it's called a separation agreement, a settlement agreement, a property settlement agreement, a marital settlement agreement, a property custody and support separation agreement. The idea is that agreement settles a potential court case for divorce addressing issues of custody, visitation, child support, spousal support, property division, debt division. Unless it's an agreement to reconcile or a cohabitation agreement, it's a divorce agreement, okay? Now, and you mentioned this idea of holding on to hope, and that ties very strongly in with the idea of denial, bargaining, grief, anger, acceptance. Sometimes, let's say, and I'm making the guy the bad guy for the moment, but I'd like to also talk about the situation where it's the other way around. But again, let's say 20-year marriage, lady's in her late 40s, she's been a homemaker, guy works, and he gives her an agreement. Or let's say he says something like, I just want some space, I'm just not happy, I think we need to live apart for a bit. No, it's not you, it's me, I'm just, I don't know, I just need to figure things out. And sometimes he's saying that out of a misplaced idea that that's nicer than saying, I want to be divorced. I want out, I want to end the marriage, I want to get a divorce. Because by telling somebody, yeah, I just need some time, no, it's no, there's not anybody else, what they're doing is they are giving that person hope. And if the person who wants out is nice to them, shows a little tenderness, they get their hopes up, oh, we're not going to have to get a divorce. And then that person sees that, and then they have to back away a little bit because they do want a divorce. And so the person being left is on this up and down roller coaster of emotion, where it is actually the kinder thing for the person who wants out to say, I'm not happy. I think that I want to end this marriage. Not I think, I know I want to end this marriage. I'm sorry. It doesn't erase the good times we've had, the good years we've had, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you. And I'm going to have an agreement drawn up. Now, just to back up even, someone might tell me, I want to tell my spouse I want a divorce, and I'll be coaching them on how to go about doing that. And it is not the best thing to say, I want a divorce, and here's an agreement, and here's how we're going to share the kids, and here's how we're going to divide the retirement, and here's who's going to move out and refinance the house. You know, the person being left has to process the idea that their marriage is ending. Let them kind of sit with that for at least a few days, if not a few weeks, you know, maybe go see an attorney, a counselor, whatever. But it is important to say, I want a divorce. So the person being left can get to acceptance and not denial bargaining, you know, oh, let me, you know, go get a job because they want me to work, and let me change my appearance and do all this and dye my hair, you know, and all this. So it's important to understand, if someone wants to end the marriage, it's a kinder thing to say, I want to end the marriage. I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you. Let's think about how we're going to create this two-home family or our new life plans. Is one concept. And then this idea of what the agreement is, that is a settlement of a possible court case for all those issues, property, support, custody. And again, the person being left isn't quite ready to start talking about that right off the bat. And the idea of fault that we sort of started with, where I use the situation of fault and adultery, you know, we can talk a little bit about what impact that might have on a settlement, and it isn't necessarily the impact that people might think.
Now, when you say that, are you talking about prenuptial agreements? I'm not really sure.
A prenuptial agreement is a whole nother thing, and that's a happy thing in a way, because I've done a number of mediated prenuptial agreements this year. This is where people are going to get married, but they're drawing up an agreement in the hopefully never situation that they'll be getting a divorce. So that's something that's done before a marriage. Let's say it's a second marriage and the people are in their 50s and they may have children and assets they want to protect, or one person has more liabilities and the other one has assets, and they want to protect themselves. So that's a whole nother creature. And if parties had a prenuptial agreement and then they're getting a divorce, the prenuptial agreement is incorporated into the divorce, and often it has to be supplemented a bit. We're kind of switching topics from divorce, but I'll simply say that when we mediate a prenuptial situation, it's almost like negotiating a divorce right before your happy wedding, and talking about what would happen in the event either party dies. So it's a delicate process when I mediate those situations. I'm so apologetic because people are happy and they're excited, and here we are talking about death and divorce. When it's an adversarial prenuptial agreement negotiation, I have had the experience these past 29 years of having at least 2 cases result in the parties not getting married, because again, they're negotiating this divorce before a marriage. And in one case, you know, the lady had an expectation that if she stayed married for 10 or 15 or 20 years, she might want to ask for alimony. But the gentleman insisted, and he had all kinds of assets, that she'd sign a prenup that said she'd never ask for alimony. In the other case, the parties were, this was many, many years ago, both of these were many years ago, they were looking to define every contingency, every possibility, so that if they ever got a divorce, they'd know who got the toaster. And no contract can address every possibility ever. There's a certain amount that you're going to have to leave to the future. So really, prenuptial agreements are a different creature than separation agreements.
Okay, so I got us off topic then. So take me back to what you were talking about then.
Well, let's say lady comes to me and she just found the cell phone records and texts and this and that. She doesn't want the divorce. But she's talking to her friends and family, and they convince her that he's just gonna move on and she needs to protect herself. And they're all telling her, you need to fight for every penny, you need to go hire a lawyer to make his life difficult, you need to get this and you need to get that, and you need to get into court, etc., because he's doing this to you. Now, where I litigate, the courts are not allowed to punish fault the way they used to. There was a time that it was pretty much a given that the party at fault would have to pay all the other side's attorney's fees. They really weren't get much property. They couldn't get support. It was a big deal to say, I'll get you for adultery or I'll get you for desertion. A vestige of that is that the party who is committing adultery nowadays has a higher burden to show if they want alimony. They have to show by clear and convincing evidence it'd be manifestly unjust to deny them alimony. So there is a vestige of fault being punished when there's adultery. We also have some laws that allow the courts to consider what are called the circumstances and factors that led to the dissolution of the marriage. I don't want to get all technical. And one last thing is the courts can also look at what are called the negative non-monetary contributions to the well-being of the family, is what we call that. Okay, we pigeonhole everything into the legal terms. So these are things that can be argued. I'm going to digress for a moment. Lawyers can argue both sides of anything, and it's my opinion that judges have a lot of latitude and discretion to do what they want. And if they want to help a party or hurt a party, they can, in their discretion, find little ways to do that. But in my experience, unless the fault is egregious, child out of wedlock, transmitting a venereal disease, serial adultery, the lady, let's say lady did not know about, or very long-term adultery that was going on years and years and years and years, and she truly didn't know, or perhaps it's affected her so much, she's gained or lost a lot of weight, she can't function, she's on antidepressants, she's crying all the time, she can't be there for her kids, she can't work. In some of those cases, the courts might divide the property, not necessarily 50-50. They may feel an equitable distribution is 60-40. And there's a case in Virginia where that is what a judge did, and the Court of Appeals affirmed that, said the court was within the court's discretion to divide the assets 60-40 because the court gave weight to this negative non-monetary contribution to the well-being of the family. But if people come to a lawyer and say, I want to get 60% of the assets because my spouse is doing this or that, and all they have is a house and a couple of 401k plans, and they don't quite realize that if their spouse wants to fully litigate that case, it could be tens of thousands of dollars, and the 10% they're hoping to get may be less than what that is. And getting back to the lady homemaker whose spouse is earning, sometimes I'll represent the spouse committing adultery. And I might advise that person to acknowledge the relationship, not make their spouse spend a lot of money on adultery surveillance, absolutely not misrepresent or lie to the court or commit a fraud on the court that the adultery or affair is not occurring when it is. But the thing is, if that person is not asking for alimony, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference, in my opinion. The lady will get a piece of paper that says he found someone he'd rather sleep with than her, and it's not going to affect custody unless we're talking about exposure to that person. But, the gentleman might say, well, I'm not going to have my paramour around them until we're engaged. And then when we're married, of course, she's going to be the stepmother. It's not going to affect the division of property very much, in my opinion, if it is garden variety adultery. And, the really awful thing that lawyers might do is tell the guy, okay, let's come up with all the, perhaps very real reasons why this adultery was a symptom of a marriage that had already ended, all the perceived inadequacies and injustices perpetrated upon you by your wife, all the reasons why your wife was not a good and dutiful spouse, the reasons why the marriage was dead. And now we're getting into court to talk about how terrible each party is, why the adultery was justified, if that is a thing, or at least in the mind of the person, why they felt justified to move on before getting a divorce. And why would you want to go there? So I find myself having to tell the lady, look, unless he wants alimony and might get it, and usually the answers to those questions are no and no, it's better for you to come to grips with this, to move on. And it's not about punishing him, because you're going to punish yourself by spending a lot of money in court, a lot of money on attorney's fees. And when the two of you fight, guess who's really going to be hurt by this? It's going to be your kids. And I have lost a client or two who just doesn't want to hear that, because people tend to gravitate towards attorneys that will validate their viewpoint, perhaps their victimhood, perhaps their desire to seek vengeance or get even or whatever, or make their spouse pay. And there are certainly lawyers that cater to that kind of market of making it ugly and difficult and terrible and awful. That's not how I conduct my practice, because I'm thinking first and foremost about the children. And I know, because I see, that the people who fight and who just can't move on are the ones who spend years and years and tens of thousands of dollars and create a situation where their kids see this behavior, because the parents are modeling how to act in adversity, and they think it's important to have, vengeance and make somebody pay, and they think that's the right thing, and it really affects them in a very, very negative way. And one last thing, I want to say that in many of my mediations, there's adultery, and I see the most tenderness that could be surprising to litigators who don't mediate, where I might see a gentleman say, I know she's having an affair. I know she's been with that person for 8 months. I know she's going to marry him once he leaves his wife. But she's the mother of my children, and I still want to pay her alimony until she remarries. I don't want her going back to work yet, because we still have little kids. I understand that it took 2 of us for this marriage to fail. It's not entirely her. And I still want to pay alimony, because if it's the lady committing adultery, and I don't want to imply that the guys always make more. Where I am in Northern Virginia, I believe that more women here earn more than their husbands than in any part of the country. So I don't want to imply that the guy always has the money and the power and the lady always, wants alimony. It's tough for guys to get alimony, but there are a lot of my clientele are very strong, powerful, high-earning women who own businesses and professional practices and etc. But I'm going to go back to the situation where lady's been the homemaker again, and I'm just saying in mediations, it may not be uncommon at all for me to hear a gentleman say that. And I've also had the situation many of the times where the guy had the affair, and the lady, who I know is still struggling with the pain of not wanting her marriage to end, knowing she has to move forward, has to start working, is never going to be as well off financially as her ex-to-be will be. But she is conducting herself with dignity. She doesn't want to drag the whole thing through the mud for the public and the kids and everybody to see. She doesn't want to spend tens of thousands of dollars. She's hurting. She's not happy about the whole thing, but she's sitting there in a mediation, and she's speaking up for herself, and we're negotiating. I'm helping them negotiate a fair settlement, and he's willing to engage in a fair settlement because he still loves her, because they were together 20 years and they had kids together. He just doesn't want to spend the rest of his life with her, and she understands that. So adultery can happen on either side. It can happen to the person who is a high earner or not the high earner. And again, how someone sets forth in dissolving their marriage, it's very important to understand what's important and what is not important. And sometimes proving that adultery and getting even and listening to all your friends and all that say you got to get them isn't necessarily the best advice. Now, I'm sorry, that was such a long answer to your statements.
These are really compound complex situations that we find ourselves in, and they deserve a thorough answer. So don't apologize for that. But now, so we've talked about adultery. What changes if, for example, there are mental health issues that bring on this divorce? What happens differently, or what should we do if that's the situation?
I've had a number of cases where there's been bipolar disorder, and in some of those cases, the person experiencing the mental health crisis is the one who wants a divorce, and their spouse is aware of their situation and doesn't want to divorce them. I don't really think I've had cases where somebody wanted to leave someone because of a significant mental health issue. So when I say mental health, I'm going to say that in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, I think they're up to DSM-5 as of 2019. If I understand this correctly, but I'm not a therapist, you have depression, you have bipolar disorder, and I believe borderline between depression and bipolar is something called borderline personality disorder, which means it's borderline in the DSM-5 between those two other issues. It's not like their personality is borderline, it's borderline on the spectrum. And from my understanding, and again, I'm not a mental health professional, I believe the way these conditions are diagnosed is if you have 6 or 8 of these 12 things, you might be someone who is characterized as borderline personality. And those traits might be something like, it's your way or no way, you're the victim, people are on your side or against you, they're your friend or your enemy, you're right, everybody else is wrong, you're better than everybody else is beneath you, you have to get the whole world on your side and tell everybody what your spouse is doing in your view of reality so that they will turn against your ex-to-be. And these are people that either had a very difficult childhood where they had to shut off their emotion and tell themselves it doesn't hurt, and they wanted their needs met, or they may have anxiety or other issues perhaps as a child, and they're all about, my needs have to be met, my needs have to be met, my needs have to be met. And if you couple that with narcissism, which is, it only matters what I need and I don't feel anybody else's pain. Somebody can be bleeding in front of me on the carpet and I'm going to be more concerned about my carpet than about their blood loss, because they only see things from what they need. So if you have someone who is a borderline narcissist, unfortunately, those people, if they have a lot of money, are all about, I have to win, it has to be my way, I don't know what I want, but it's going to be the opposite of whatever you want, whatever that is, whenever you tell me, because I'm just going to keep finding reasons not to settle this because I want to make you pay, make you suffer. And I've had cases with people like that literally went on for the whole life of a child's minority till they were 18, like 6 years, until a client runs out of money, and then they're doing it on their own for even longer. I've had cases where there were multiple hearings on custody and this and that because somebody just couldn't let it go until the other person paid and lost everything. And that kind of a mental health issue, that's borderline narcissistic personality disorder isn't really something you take a pill for. That is a personality that's not going to change. And in those cases, that's all about explaining to a client, it's about setting limits. It's about modeling how to set limits for your kids, because this person has a way of dangling carrots and sticks and appearing very charming to the rest of the world who has no idea that they've got everybody at home walking on eggshells and that they're such a tyrant. And these people can be male or female, by the way. It's not like this is just one gender that can have these traits. So somebody might decide, and moving back a bit to bipolar disorder, I found that, that's such a difficult illness because, there might be little signs when somebody's 18, but, people act a little bit odd every now and then when they're around 18. And then there's some quirkiness in the early 20s, but who isn't a little quirky in their early 20s? And then in the 30s, this person starts to really be struggling, and they might be self-medicating with alcohol, which creates a whole host of other problems. And if they don't address the chemical imbalance, which is all that bipolar disorder is, by getting on the right medication, it just seems to get worse and worse and worse to where we're starting to see commitments, suicide attempts, things like this, until someone is finally diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And then what can happen after the commitment and they're on medication, again, denial, bargaining, grief, anger, acceptance. Oh, I'm better now. I don't want to keep taking the meds. There's side effects. I don't like the side effects. I'm cured now. It's all better. And then they have a relapse. And there is a slight genetic component to bipolar disorder. So there's a possibility that the child of someone who has that has bipolar. And I might ask a client, are there mental health issues in that side of the family? Have there been commitments, suicide attempts? Oh, well, this or that one's uncle or aunt or whatever was such an alcoholic. And that might be somebody who is self-medicating because they didn't have insurance, their disease.
Right.
So, sometimes there's bipolar disorder where one or the other decides they don't want the marriage anymore. I've had many situations in 29 years, I can think of 5 off the top of my head, where people attempted suicide. It's not uncommon when somebody is suffering from bipolar disorder. And it can be either one of those parties that's trying to end the marriage. And again, if a child is ever going to find that the stress of the situation brings out some of their mental health issues, it's important to have a parent who models the right behavior. I have a chemical brain imbalance. I have gotten myself diagnosed. I've gotten on a regimen of drugs. I don't like the side effects, but the side effects are not as bad compared to what it's like to not be on the medication, perhaps. It's a decision to make with a psychiatrist and a doctor, but typically bipolar is something that needs to be controlled if it can be through medication. So, here the divorce might be about compassion. It might be about the cost of the divorce. Do you need to pay for a guardian ad litem to represent the person with the mental health issue if they're, suffering with that? Is this about compassion? Is it about not being compassionate? There are so many reasons why people get a divorce. Falling out of love is one, adultery is one, being tired of being abused by somebody. And I would say that most abusers, and there are male and female abusers out there, I think that the people who are physically abusive are people often who are kind of borderline personality or kind of narcissistic or have some sort of mental health issue or have a substance abuse issue. But I'll also say that substance abuse issues often arise because of a mental health issue like depression or anxiety or something that hasn't been addressed. So divorce can be an opportunity also for the person who might be engaging in these dysfunctional behaviors to take stock, get some help, find out the root of all this. And again, I'm giving you such a long answer, Natalie, but often why a person is unhappy might very well be because of the demons from their own childhood, their own abusive childhood, the pain that they felt as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old that they never got in touch with to release. They just told themselves, it doesn't hurt, it's okay, it doesn't matter, I don't feel anything. But what they've done is they've shut off their heart. So then they get involved in this marriage where they're never able to fully give themselves emotionally and intimately to this other person. They might just be more involved in pornography, or they have some other sex addiction that they're keeping secret, because they just can't open themselves and be vulnerable because they were wounded as a child. And finally, when the marriage falls apart because of all the dysfunction, the cure for that is to do the intensive therapy to realize, yes, when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, and my alcoholic mother, father beat me, abandoned me, did this or that, it hurt. It hurt so much. And to feel that pain only for the simple purpose of letting it go. Because if you can't bring it to the surface, you can't let it go. And you can't heal unless you let it go. And then for someone battling an addiction or who has certain mental health issues, it really requires a lot of work to find out where those dysfunctions, that pain all came from. Often it is from childhood. But I've also found unfortunately, that if people don't do this really intensive work by the time they're 50, in my personal opinion, they're unlikely to ever do it. The time to do it, I seem to see for people who genuinely, and I have seen people and worked with people who genuinely try to address their sexual addiction, their pain, their substance abuse, get into recovery, get themselves diagnosed with their mental health issue, get on the meds for bipolar. When people really truly want to work on themselves, they seem to do it in their 30s and 40s. If they haven't done it by the time they're 50, a lady comes to me and says, my husband's this way, he's 54. I'm likely to tell her, he's not likely to change.
Yeah. Now, maybe this is off topic, I don't really know, but I read recently that millennials have a much lower rate of divorce than our generation and our parents' generation. And the supposition was that's because they're waiting to get married until a much later age, a much older age than, for example, you and I were.
Yeah.
When I was at university, there was some fairly substantial pressure put on me by my grandparents and great-grandparents. Tick-tock, tick-tock, you're 21.
Yeah.
Come on.
Such a young age.
And
absolutely.
Retrospectively, 21. I mean, my friends were being married right out of high school and in mid-university, and we were children. Yes. What chance did we stand? But the social pressure was there, and because we were young and inexperienced, we caved to it. So the idea that you're talking about, having your house in order, knowing yourself, being happy with yourself, addressing your life, your choices, your issues, makes you a much better partner, I think is what this article was getting to about the idea that millennials have a much lower rate of divorce.
Yeah, let's talk about those social issues for a bit. You mentioned my book can help 50%, you mentioned, of the general population, and I presume you meant because that's the population that gets, or 50% of marriages, perhaps you were thinking in a divorce. I think I've heard recently, the last big poll that was done, it was about 45%. So it's, as you mentioned, going down. And there are quite a few reasons for that. I think one, there used to be a bit of a stigma, we met online, people who are finding their mates online are actually finding mates who share some of their goals and passions and viewpoints and have certain commonalities. Okay. Whereas I think I saw in a TED Talk or something that years ago, people married more frequently than not somebody who lived within a half-mile radius of their apartment building or their home. They tended to marry people in the neighborhood. They weren't spreading the net out larger. And I will also say that I've been practicing divorce law since 1989. And I started off never having divorces where people were married 20 years. Something happened in 1994. I remember this, where all of a sudden I had 12 cases of people who'd been married 20 years. I noticed it. It's like, oh, wow, 20 years. Ooh. And then ever since 94, it's grown and grown and grown to where easily half or more of my practice are people who've been married 20 years. So I thought about that a little while ago, and I realized, what was it about 94? And then I thought, if somebody were married 20 years in 94, they got married in 74. And if they got married in 74 at age 20 some odd, they were born in the 50s, okay? So that was a generation of people in the 50s and earlier that did not divorce. Women in the US really did not work prior, let me rephrase that. Very many women in the US worked outside the home prior to World War II. After World War II, more women got into the workforce, and it's just increased ever since. And there was a generation of women who were just trapped. It's my cross to bear. The guy who deserted his wife was the worst of the worst because, there may not have even been welfare at one point. And there she was with nothing, no job, no possibility of earning enough to support 2, 3, 4 kids. You really didn't see too many divorces. Women hung in there when it was a bad marriage. I'm not implying that the reason for all divorce is because the guy is, the problem. But when the guy was a problem, the women stayed in there more frequently because they didn't have the means, the ability, the income to move forward. That's no longer the case. Men and women, I think, divorce in equal numbers. You know, the one that wants out half the time is the guy, half the time is the gal. I don't see it more being more the gal or more the guy or more the guy's fault or more the gal's fault. It's just all the same. You know, there's no, I'm not a guy's lawyer, a gal's lawyer. Those considerations are just absolutely irrelevant to me. I think about the children, and if anything, I want to be the children's attorney. And if my client is doing a disservice to their children, I let them know. And, you know, as an aside, I'll also say I've been doing this long enough. I'm going to speak my truth. If my client is drinking excessively and not addressing that, if my client has a mental health or other issue that, in my opinion, isn't serving their children very well, and perhaps they'd be better serving their children if they addressed it. Not that I'm the be all and end all of what a great parent is, but if somebody's abusing their kids or driving around drunk with them, there's a right and there's a wrong, and sometimes it's not too hard to see what's wrong. And I will let my client know that. And if I lose that person as a client, oh, well, it's unfortunate because they're just going to go to some lawyer who's going to validate their victimhood and validate their feelings of being put upon and their desire to get even and get revenge and fight for this or that. But I will always speak my truth.
I think that's laudable. I think that as difficult as it might be for some of us to hear what you have to say to us, in the end, that you have our and our children's best interest at heart, speaks really highly of you and your professionalism, the depth to which you're willing to take your fiduciary responsibilities. And so I think that that's a laudable thing to do.
I thank you. And I take that seriously. You know, a lady might come to me, she's been living in the country club for 10 years. She hasn't had to work. Her husband's on his fifth affair. And I'm not talking about anybody in particular. I'm talking a conglomeration of many, many people that I've seen over time. And she doesn't want to work. She doesn't want to go out and work. She's got a bachelor's degree. She might have worked 20 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, but she just doesn't want, for whatever reason. I'm not saying it's laziness. It could be fear. It could be insecurity, whatever reason. And when I tell that lady, we need to dust off your resume. We need to think about what you want to do. You're 43, 45 years old. You got to get out in the workforce. You're never going to get enough alimony to provide for you the way you want to live. And there is a subset of people who, I always lose these people as clients. They don't want to hear that because everybody's telling them, oh, that'll hurt your alimony case if you get a job. You know, you're not going to get so much alimony, even if you get a job at $40,000. It doesn't mean that you still can't ask for alimony. Maybe you won't get as much, but you're starting a career. You might be able to put a little bit away in retirement that you're not going to do with the alimony. And he can seek to modify that alimony when he wants to retire. And you can spend $20,000 trying to fight that and lose, and there goes your alimony just 10 or 15 years from now, and you've done, you know, very little. So the people who don't want to hear what they don't want to hear will go find a lawyer who tells them what they want to hear. I do have a strong and dedicated clientele that come to me because they kind of know what they need to do, and they need somebody to tell them. Not that I'm, you know, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do that. But I will explain with compassion about creating a new life plan that might involve doing this or doing, you know, leaving your abusive spouse and doing this and ending the codependency because you're in love with what he used to be or could be or should be or what you want them to be, but not what he or she actually is. And you need to end that dysfunctional relationship that brings you no pain or no joy, only pain, more pain than joy. Some people know in the back of their mind what they need to do, and they kind of want somebody who will encourage them to do that. And
sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes we just need to have somebody say it to us in a mom voice.
Oh gosh. I wouldn't like to think that I'm using a mom voice, but okay.
But
Or as a friend, as an advisor, as a counselor, to say, and I'd like to also point out, every now and then I'll have a mediation where perhaps the guy doesn't want to pay a whole lot of spousal support. And, my hourly rate currently is $4.20 an hour. So the people that come to see me generally are doing well. They have a good salary. They have a lot of assets. It might be a high asset divorce with a lot of stock options and complications and retirements, and people who own businesses and professional practices. So I might have a gentleman, let's say, who sort of has this attitude, she's got the ability to be an accountant. She could go do this. She could go do that. She should work in a company. She should go get a job. And she should get that job like tomorrow. And I don't want to pay all this alimony. And I'll look at him and say, oh, I hear you. Let me ask you something. In your position, do you hire people? Oh, yeah, I hire people all the time. Well, how many years have you been hiring people? Oh, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. In all that time, how many women over 45 who've been out of the job market for 10 years have you hired? Bing. Okay, I can see all of a sudden, they're realizing the answer is none, because it's really tough to get a job in a big company when you've been out of the market for 10 whole years and you're over 45. Is there age discrimination in this world? Yeah. And once you're on that other side of 45, or God forbid 50, oh my gosh, it's especially if you haven't been working for 5 or 10 years. So that's why that mid 40s is a time you got to get yourself out there. You can't be looking for a job at 48, 50 when you haven't been working for 5 or 10 years. Unless you want to stand up do retail on weekends and nights, and even that you may not get the job. So it's important, I think, for people to realize that they're not going to their life isn't just going to go on without any blips. When you have 1 or 2 good incomes in one household, and then you're going to have 1 or 2 good incomes in 2 households, the standard of living is going to drop in both. And it's going to drop more heavily in the life of the person who's not earning. I will say sometimes to people, look, if you're making $150,000 in 5 years, you're going to make how much? And this other person who might make $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year, in 5 years, how much are they going to make? And at the end of the day, if you're paying an extra $200 a month or $500 a month, think also about what lessons you're telling your kids. Mommy can't go to, I don't want to slam them, but Ben and Jerry's or Sweet Frog and spend $15 on 3 ice creams, which is what it might cost.
Yeah.
She doesn't have money like that, but dad can. And what does that teach the kids about money and power and all this? And do you really want the lesson to be that everybody's dependent on dad's income? So yes, I will encourage women to get themselves back out there. Spousal support is still very much a situation where it's women asking for the money. The laws here in Virginia on spousal support are gender neutral. I have actually obtained spousal support where for a guy, when the lady was paying it. I've obtained spousal support even when there was adultery. But it's generally, the case where it's guy paying gal. But gal should still, in my opinion, try to maximize her earnings. And I really have so much respect for people who come to me and say, it's awful, it's terrible, I didn't want this to happen, my spouse is leaving me. I've started looking at online courses. I've started looking at what to do to get into this or that field. I'm going to need this many years or this much money, or I'm addressing my mental health issues, or I'm in therapy. I got on some short-term meds. I'm in recovery. I'm going to AA 3 times a day, have a sponsor. I'm going to taper it down once I get, more of a handle on things. I have the utmost respect for people who address those issues and become a better person. And, divorce, to kind of go on for a little bit here on another area, divorce is a hard event in life, and divorce can be conflict. And there's 2 aspects there. If people have children, they're modeling for their children how to conduct themselves through conflict. You know, are you a victim? Are you vengeful? Do you have to get even? Is it about telling everybody how awful your spouse is? Is it about punishing them in court and beating them up? Or is it about holding your head high, maybe looking at, did you have any responsibility for the demise of the marriage? What do you do in a bad situation to move forward, address your physical needs, your mental health needs, to take care of yourself, to be strong? How do you show your kids how to conduct yourself through that difficult process? And the other kind of adjunct to that is it can be an opportunity for personal growth. Um, I've definitely seen people who reinvented themselves, who took a path that they wouldn't have otherwise taken to improve themselves and improve their life because of the divorce. And sometimes it can be liberating. I've also had cases where people decided that they wanted to get involved in that same-sex relationship and get into that lifestyle because they've been living a lie for a long time. That's not overwhelmingly uncommon. I've had, you know, a bunch of cases like that where somebody had to move on and live their true self. So it can be liberating. It can be freeing if you've been in an abusive relationship. But I'm also mindful of the fact that where I am in Northern Virginia, we have a very diverse population. A lot of people from countries where they still have family back home, where divorce is looked upon as a very stigmatizing thing, very dishonorable thing. And there can be very strong ramifications for them in leaving their spouse. But maybe it's the right thing to do, and they're just trying to, you know, move things forward. And even though their families may not support them, it might be the right thing to show a daughter that you don't have to stay in a relationship that's physically abusive, that you can find your way, you can move forward. It's a process. And sometimes it's just a little garden variety thing. We do a little agreement, we have a little uncontested no-fault divorce, life goes on, people move on. Maybe they have a great co-parenting schedule and they're the best of friends afterwards. It's all good. You know, that's about half of the divorces. They're really very amicable. But, you know, what we've been talking about really are the other 25 or so percent or 10% where there's a lot of pain, anguish, difficulty, anger. And, you know, I do want to talk at some point about the more agreeable divorces, because that is 50 to 75% in my practice. We've been focusing heavily on that 25 or so that is more difficult.
So, you know, a lot of people really have negative experiences with divorce, and I understand that it is that way. But I want to give a shout out to a cousin of mine. She didn't finish high school. She married an artist, a very well-known artist, and supported his career. They got an amicable divorce simply because his lifestyle became untenable once they had a child. But she did go on to get married, and she married someone that worked for the business that she had started and made extremely successful. So this is a young woman that didn't finish high school, married a nomadic artist, lived in the back of a pickup truck for years until they had a child, then created this business that became extraordinarily successful and was a multi-millionaire in her early 20s. She then faced some relationship challenges, and because I think she had such a great respect for the person that she was, when it came time for that relationship to end, she recognized that she was the breadwinner and that her partner was the person who had taken care of the children, and that she needed to do everything she could to maintain that status quo. She needed to keep earning money to keep everyone in that lifestyle that they had become accustomed to, and she needed to leave their children with their primary caregiver. And that realization seemed to be more liberating than the separation. when she realized that she had always been that person and she needed to maintain and continue being that person, that was a super important turning point for her mentally and emotionally. And it really altered the outcome of the way they proceeded.
Right. You know, kids need both parents, and I am a big proponent of that. And when parents put the children first, they will live right near each other, and they will share the care of those children. What we often see, I used to be adverse to this idea of shared physical custody. I remember in the 90s telling people, oh, you're just putting off the inevitable fight you're going to have someday when somebody's going to move away or whatever. You may as well do it now. Shared custody can't work. And in the 90s, we didn't really see it. People started coming to me in the 2000s to mediate, and they're like, oh, and we're going to do this shared custody thing. And more people were coming to me saying, oh, we're going to do the shared custody thing. And it just started taking off in the 2000, 2010, really last 20 years. And for people who mediate, who live near each other and are committed to co-parenting, it is common, if not almost the status quo, that Monday, Tuesday is one parent, Monday night, Tuesday night is one parent, Wednesday night, Thursday night is the other parent, and they alternate Friday to Monday night. It is not complicated. There's 2 transitions a week. Every Wednesday to, let's say, dad, and then back to mom Monday or Friday. And I have a very educated clientele here in Northern Virginia. Got a lot of tech companies, and sometimes people come to me with spreadsheets. We got this alternating 3-day, 4-day, 4-day, 3-day thing, and you got a whole Excel sheet and all this. And then we talk about the transition to guy or gal on Wednesday and to the other one back on Monday night or Friday night, depending on who had the weekend. It looks like 2255, 2255. And sometimes we play with it a little bit. We might say, well, the girls really like starting the school week in one house, so maybe his weekend ends Sunday night. Or there's a boy and a girl, and it'd be good to have some mommy-son time and daddy-daughter time and mommy-daughter time and daddy-son time. So the first week of every month, on her Tuesday and his Wednesday, they'll each have one child. Or maybe there's a 3, 4, 2, 5-year-old that the 5 days is a lot when somebody has the weekend. So maybe on Sunday, we're going to carve out from 12 to 5 for the other parent to have a 5-hour visit. But this idea of Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, alternate Friday to Monday night is extraordinarily popular. I've found that people who cannot co-parent, but what I often see, many cases where guy, let's say, insists on having his half the time for whatever reason, and she just doesn't want to fight him, so she gives in. They tend to do this pass off on Fridays or Sundays, week on, week off, week on, week off. And that's a long time for a child not to see a parent. But I'll have clients in mediation that sometimes they've been married 20 years, they got a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, they're doing well, so the kids are in every kind of activity, and he's got to pick her up, and then she's going to pick him up, and then he's got to get her over there, and she's going to bring him there. And they look at each other and they say, do we need a schedule? Do we need no, we don't need a schedule, because they're going to just keep doing what they've been doing all this time. We have a framework, we have a fallback, because those kids need to know there's a plan, there's a schedule, but that schedule might get altered a lot, but they have a plan. Sometimes I'll ask people, do you want to determine holiday time? Do we need? No, we'll work that out. So my agreement, if it's a mediation, might say fair and equitable sharing or alternation of holidays, special time, etc. Other times, especially in litigation cases, we're going to define every holiday, even years this person from this time to that time, odd years this person from that time to that time. We got 15 other provisions that determine how the transition should occur and what kind of things everybody should do. There's an awful lot of people that co-parent very well. And there was a time, I remember in the 90s, I had some cases where a lady really maybe didn't want to have custody for whatever reason, but they felt they couldn't say it. Back then, especially in the 90s, what kind of woman wouldn't want to take care of her kids, And there was a huge stigma about that. And I've also watched over the last 29 years, guys get way more involved with their kids. There was a time in the late, I guess I started in 89, early 90s, the guy got to visit with his kids every other weekend from about 10 a.m. Saturday to 4 p.m. Sunday, 2 hours every other Wednesday when he did not have the weekend coming up. He'd get every other holiday and 2 weeks in the summer as long as he wasn't working, and that was status quo. Over the years, and I remember having a fight, we finally got the Friday night, the weekend to start on Friday night, and as more guys were getting their kids off to school, getting them to the bus, often their weekends started to end with return to school Monday. So finally we got from Friday after school to Monday morning, and the Wednesday 2 hours every other week turned into every Wednesday overnight. That's still a fairly, in this area, common minimal thing a guy will get. Now, the custody laws here are gender neutral. There are 3 places in the law where the Virginia General Assembly, where I practice in Virginia, has made it clear that there's no presumption in favor of either parent. There used to be what was called a tender years presumption in my state, where children up to about age 9 were presumed to belong with mom unless there was a reason not to have her care for them, and that presumption could be rebutted. But it's still tough for guys to win a primary custody case, all things being equal. It is still tough. Every case I've won for guys, I had to show something was wrong with mom. And, why should that be? I don't know. There have been efforts in Virginia to have a default presumption of 50-50 custody, but it falls short every time on a vote in the Virginia General Assembly. But I can't say that's wrong, because shared physical custody only works when the parents can co-parent and they live near each other and they're not making the kids commuter kids. And if they have to go to court, almost by default, if they can't work it out and they've got to litigate it, they're not necessarily going to be the greatest at co-parenting like the people who mediate are. But it has definitely changed over the last 30 years in terms of how much time guys get with their kids. And as the judges, who used to be products of the 30s and 40s and a different lifestyle, have started leaving the bench, and guys who actually were involved in raising their kids and got them off to school and put them to bed at night and bathed them, as they start taking the bench. And as women who have husbands who do things like that and understand that our husbands should be as much involved with our kids as we are, there's been a bit of a change with that over time. But getting back to your cousin, there was a time when, a woman who didn't want her kids, no, I'm not saying that's the case, but who didn't fight for primary custody, was stigmatized. And there's still a little bit of that to some extent, but it's more the flip side of that has changed, that there are guys who have been the primary caretakers, the stay-at-home guy. Like I said, more women in this area earn more than the guys. And a lot of them, the guys are staying home and caring for the kids. And there's one last subset I want to mention. Every now and then I'll have cases, it's not uncommon, where the lady tells me, I think he saw a lawyer because all of a sudden he's going to all the soccer games, he wants to go to all the doctor's appointments, he's helping them with their homework, he's putting them to bed, he's bathing them, what is that? And I'm like, well, is that a good thing? Oh, it's fantastic. I wish he'd done that years ago. Maybe we wouldn't have been getting a divorce. And I do see cases where she's had enough. She's been working, taking care of the kids, taking care of the house, doing everything. And, he's like an extra kid that she's taking care of, and she's had enough and she wants to end the marriage. All of a sudden he's realizing, oh my gosh, I might lose time with my kids. And he becomes Mr. Super Dad, and he starts doing everything. And I will tell you, without exception, every woman has said, it's a great thing. I wish he'd done it sooner. And the judges will say the same thing. If a woman has this kind of little, attitude and goes to court and says, well, judge, he never did those things, and now he's just doing everything. The judge only hears that, and now he's doing everything, because that's a good thing.
That's excellent. I love that example.
I don't mean to come across like I'm slamming women or favoring guys. What I'm trying to say is, over 30 years that I've been practicing, 29, I've seen this change in how much men are parenting their children. It has changed over time, largely because the women are working the tough jobs too. And, they need, I hate to say this, help. but they just can't do it all themselves. So there's this natural sharing that has occurred over the past few decades, and the courts are recognizing that and giving guys more time. And women, every now and then I'll have a client who is a little bit reticent about leaving the children with him, and I'll say, I remember when my kids were little, oh my gosh, I think I went like 10 years without ever having like a nap, and I would say, wouldn't you love to have a nap, or just to go out somewhere, or just to have the house to yourself, or
just use the bathroom by yourself? Yeah.
And then they start thinking about that, like, yeah, I guess that isn't a terrible, horrible thing. Is he going to abuse them? Is he going to neglect them? And I've also had the case where somebody has been very much caring for the children and is kind of afraid to leave them with the guy, and they have to sort of get over that. Or I've had a case, many cases, where the guy is so afraid she's going to take away the kids. When people come to see me, there's a lot of fear. People are afraid of what's going to happen with money, with their kids. How will they get enough? Do they have to pay too much? Will they lose time with their kids? Will they get enough time with their kids? And there's a kind of guy, I've had many cases like this, where I'm either representing the guy or the lady, where he's so afraid that he's going to lose time with the kids, and he threatens. I'm hearing a little bit of oddness in the recording here. I don't know if it sounds normal to you, so I'm just going to keep going.
It's bouncing back and forth, and it might be this storm that we're experiencing here messing with our Wi-Fi.
So I'm going to say that sometimes the guy will say, I'm going to take the kids. I'm not going to let you have them. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And the lady comes to me, and I'll say, will he abuse your children? No. Does he know how to care for them? Yes. Do you really think he wants to have them all the time? Oh, there's no way he could deal with these 2- and 3-year-old kids. He would go nuts. He can barely watch them for 4 hours. Let him take them. Oh my God, do you really think he's not going to bring them back? No, he will. And so sometimes this person just needs to flex their muscle, prove that they can do it, take them away for the weekend, take them away for a vacation, take them away for a week. Sometimes people will make threats. I'm going to take this child. You'll never see this child again. I've had many times that somebody's come to me and said their spouse said they'd do that. It's extraordinarily rare for that to happen. I've met with thousands of people over 29 years. I've worked with thousands of people. I'll see hundreds each year. And there's just a particular kind of person that might actually take a child and go leave them in another country with family there, or will leave their job here and go live in that country. And that's almost like never. I mean, it really isn't a big concern. It's a way to try to control somebody and make them be afraid by threatening to do that sort of thing. But often it's a matter of almost calling that bluff and having somebody realize that no, and again, I don't mean not to be vilifying the guy, but he really may not want those kids as much as you think. He's trying to upset you, trying to scare you, trying to keep you from leaving. Sometimes that's what's going on.
Yeah, I would say that's probably more often than not the case. So, well, we have barely touched on some of the really important issues that you bring out in your book, The 4 Ways of Divorce. And your insights are so valuable. And I know that we're coming kind of to the end of the time that we set aside. I would love to have you back on the channel and continue this conversation and keep talking about it, because we've only gotten through chapter 2 of the book.
Well, I do want to say one last thing that's important. We seem to have touched upon more of the ugliness and difficulties, but I want to reiterate, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, we can talk another time, but probably 50% of the people who see me have a very amicable, easily resolved situation, and a very amicable, easily resolved divorce. That's about half the people. 25% of the time, they're going to horse trade a little bit, see how far they can push, or it's very complicated, we know we're not going to go to court, but we might all pretend a little bit, you know, make some threats, but we all kind of know we're not going to go to court. That's 75% of the people. It's 25% I've found anecdotally in my practice that start in the whole adversarial litigation thing, and really only 3%, 1 to 2% in my practice that completely thoroughly litigate everything. I don't market to that 1 or 2 or 3%. There are some law firms who do, or who try to turn every case into that 1 or 2 or 3%. I think there's a certain spot in hell for those people because, you know, there's a very tiny number of attorneys out there who will try to make every case into a whole battle when it's not necessary. And sometimes their clients don't even realize they're doing it, or sometimes their client wants them to do that and they're validating that. But it's really 75% of the time, I believe, that people resolve things very amicably, and at least 50% of the time, super amicably co-parenting. So let's just give a shout out to those people. It's an honor and a privilege to work with people like that. And sometimes though, and we didn't really talk about when, but sometimes you do need to stand up and fight when there's violence or addictive issues or mental health issues. And you might need restraining orders, criminal charges, restraint on dissipation of assets, temporary emergency custody orders. You know, that's that 25% that, you know, sometimes you got to back up a truck, empty out the house, and go off to another state. May or may not be the best thing to do all that, but might be perfectly legal. So you have to understand, sometimes it can be worked out, sometimes you got to fight it out. And we talk more today about the times when it's not worked out as easily.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that most humans are good humans. And we find ourselves in tough situations, but most of us can recognize that, or we can find someone like you that helps us recognize that we need to be maybe hard on the issues at hand, but we still need to be gentle with our fellow humans and with our families, because those relationships aren't just over once that paperwork gets signed off on. And so finding someone like you that helps us look hard at the issues and look gently on the people, I think that's a really important message. And I think one that most people are amenable to hearing.
Well, it's been a lot of fun talking with you, Natalie, and I hope that this conversation can be helpful to some people. We talked kind of about what sort of things happen, not so much so what do you do about it, but at least to leave your listeners with this idea of denial, bargaining, grief, anger, acceptance. Then comes get informed, and then make a plan. And the first plan is, how do you want to resolve things? Litigate, negotiate, collaborate, or mediate. Check out my book. And the next make a plan is, where do you want to be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now? Because that's what you're working towards, whether you work it out or fight it out.
Right. So, Rachel, I want to invite you back, and we'll pick up this conversation and we'll move on to the next section. And then in the description section, like I said, I'm going to put your contact information, so that if someone has watched this video and they appreciate the position that you take in helping your clients, they can just contact you directly and move on to those next stages. Or we hope that they will click on the next video and continue watching the series so that they get the gist of the entire storyline.
Sounds like a plan. Sounds good. Thank you for having me on, Natalie. It's been my pleasure.
Rachel, it's been absolutely a joy talking to you. I really appreciate your sensitivity, your professionalism, your experience that you bring to the conversation, and mostly that you're a good human. I think that that's a really large part of why I like and respect you so much, is that you're just—
Thank you for all your kind words, Natalie.
So thank you very much. And again, everybody, if you haven't already, subscribe, like, hit the little bell so that you get those notification reminders. Share this video if you know someone who is experiencing something like this, might need a little bit of help or guidance. Copy the link, send it over to them, share it with them on their social media, and encourage them to find a professional that works the way that Rachel does. Thanks very much, everybody. Hope to see you soon.